All right. Well, if there's anybody here who has not yet voted, please go vote. They're going to record this. You can see this anytime. But and also, if you really are checking your phones and anything really good happens, will you please let the rest of us know? So thank you, Tom. And thanks. Is Kim Abley here? To her for the work that she did organizing. And thanks to Patrick Brenzel and Chad Goldberg for the work that they did in getting this whole series started off a couple of years ago. I'm really happy to be here with you tonight. It's taking my mind off of things, among other things. So as we start out this hour, you might wonder what the Wisconsin uprising, that outpouring of protests that followed the announcement of what was called Act 10 back in 2011, has to do with the Wisconsin idea. At first glance, the connection might not be obvious, but by the end of tonight's talk, I hope to have convinced you that there's a real and important connection. And to do that, I'm going to make an argument in three parts. First, I want to draw out some of the unspoken assumptions of the Wisconsin idea. And specifically, I want to scrutinize the vision of the public sector that it has at its heart. Second, I want to offer maybe an iconoclastic, perhaps, but a reinterpretation of what was going on in the 2011 protests. If you ask most people, they will say the protests were about the governor taking away the collective bargaining rights of public workers. And that is absolutely true. But I want to argue that while at one level the protests were about labor issues, they were also about defending the public sector. And then finally, I want to argue that the vision of the public sector's role that's at the heart of the Wisconsin idea is far from being a point of social consensus. It is not a warm, fuzzy, kumbaya, hearts and bunnies kind of concept that everyone agrees on, but it's been extremely controversial over the past 120 years. And it's erupted into conflict at three distinct periods, the 1930s, the 1970s, and 2011. So I want to talk about those moments of conflict, and then hopefully we can all have a discussion about where we are in that debate at the present moment and what that means for the future of the Wisconsin idea. So just first a word of acknowledgement. The research behind this talk was an offshoot of a larger research project funded by the National Science Foundation and supported by the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. So as I was preparing for this talk, Kim Abley suggested that I watch a video of Gwen Drury's presentation last fall on the meaning of the Wisconsin idea. And I really appreciated that suggestion because I learned so much from watching that video. What I got from Gwen's talk that I didn't know before was some detail about the context in which the Wisconsin idea arose. For example, at that time, Wisconsin had one of the most corrupt political systems in the nation, dominated by large businesses and their machine politics. And for another, one of the big motivations for those who thought up and promoted the Wisconsin idea was the rampant inequality of the time. Gwen was very insistent on that in her talk. Wisconsin's economy and its political life were dominated by big corporations and the trusts that ran the railroads, big moneyed families in timber, and monopolies for other important resources. According to Gwen, and she cited many excellent historians to back up her point, the Wisconsin idea was originally a project to wrest control of government from these special moneyed special interests, and to make it work for the good of a much larger segment of the population. So based on these historical sources, she defined the Wisconsin idea in this way. And you can all read. I won't read it to you. There are two important aspects of this definition. The first is the opposition to predatory wealth. That's pretty obvious. The second is maybe a little more subtle. The emphasis on government drawing on the knowledge resources of the public university as a counterweight and solution to the problem. So historical sources support this definition of the Wisconsin idea. The progressive era Wisconsin political scientist Charles McCarthy, in his book on the Wisconsin idea published in 1912, which I wouldn't know about if it weren't for Gwen, who's sitting right here in the front row, wrote that its designers were acting in response to monopoly, trusts, the high cost of living, and predatory wealth. And he argued that John Bascom and Richard Ely and many others who were involved in creating the Wisconsin idea believed that men deserved the right of opportunity, that it was the duty of the state to preserve to them opportunities, that the state was a necessary good and not a necessary evil. Private property was good and existed for the public good, but if any particular part of it did not exist for the public good, it should be made to do so. So that's pretty radical, and the state's at the center of that concept. Both Ely and Bascom believed in the principle that the state must invest in the life and happiness of the individual to ensure widespread prosperity. According to Arthur Altmeyer, a former Wisconsin Commissioner of Social Security, the essence of Bascom's teaching in the Wisconsin idea was the belief that government had an affirmative obligation to promote the well-being of its citizens and that the university had the obligation to serve the state to achieve that objective. And Richard Ely wrote, "We regard the state as an agency whose positive assistance is one of the indispensable preconditions of human progress." So not only was the Wisconsin idea envisioned and created in response to this great inequality in the Gilded Age and the way that money bought and dominated the political system of that era, but its creators specifically saw government as the remedy to that problem, a way of taking government back from the special interests for citizens and to provide for collective well-being. So, Wisconsin's early 20th century progressive reformers put those knowledge resources to work to amazing use. And you've probably heard recited the list of the new programs and policies and laws coming out of Wisconsin at that time. The nation's first workers' compensation program, the first state income tax, a legislative research reference bureau that, as I learned from Gwen, became the model for the Congressional Research Service, an activist industrial commission, a living wage law, a slew of other protections for labor, unemployment compensation. All of these programs were designed with input from faculty and sometimes students at the University of Wisconsin. Institutional economists like John Commons and Edwin Whitty spearheaded Wisconsin's workers' compensation and unemployment compensation programs. And these frameworks that they developed became the model for other states, and eventually these men were tapped to help design national level versions and our nationwide Social Security program. But there were many, many other less famed but extremely consequential innovations. Whitty advised the Wisconsin legislature on new antitrust laws. The University School of Medicine collaborated with state agencies to solve problems of public health, establishing the State Laboratory of Hygiene right next door to us here, and a system of sanatoriums for tuberculosis. The School of Agriculture established short courses that helped states' farmers transition from wheat crops that were depleting the soil to dairy farming. And as early as 1912, even before many of these contributions had materialized, Frederick Howe could say that Wisconsin had become an experiment station in politics, in social and industrial legislation, in the democratization of science and higher education, a statewide laboratory in which popular government is being tested in its reaction on people, the distribution of wealth, and social well-being. So these progressive projects were successful, progressive era projects were successful to a large degree because they found a strong base of support in Wisconsin's business community, not among the railroad trusts and the logger barons and their allies, who formed part of the Republican Party that was known at that time as the Stalwarts, but among mid-sized Wisconsin-based firms, many of which were owned by German immigrants who clustered in the progressive branch of the Republican Party. These progressive businessmen were receptive to elements of welfare capitalism similar to those that they had known in the old country. So they were sympathetic to things like workers' compensation because they had seen how they worked in Germany and in England. They adhered to a version of free market ideology that was popular in Germany called ordoliberalism. And ordoliberalism held that the full capacity of markets required them to be embedded in a robust social and legal order. Practically speaking, they saw programs like workers' compensation as being beneficial because they made the cost of doing right by workers regular and predictable, something that you could cost into your budget on a yearly basis. In working on all of these diverse projects, the practitioners of the Wisconsin idea contributed to building a concept that I reference in the title of the talk, what Daniel Bell called the public household. As a sociologist, we might wonder why Bell chose the term public household rather than more well-known labels like the public sector or public goods. And I think that he did it because it highlights the need to work out through democratic governance problems of common living. For him, the public household was, in part, the arena for meeting common needs and providing goods and services that individuals can't provide for themselves. But that's the definition of public goods that most economists use. And they, depending on what kind of economist you are, but many of them see those as encompassing three basic functions: the military, the police, and the courts. Bell had a more expansive version of what should be included in this list of services that individuals can't procure for themselves. And he would say that underwriting, science, and technology fit in that category, for example, and supporting citizens by protecting their civil rights and providing a socially agreed upon net of safety net services. So with the term public household, Bell was referencing the collective institutions, both economic and political, that provide for the well-being of citizens. And just as members of a household don't always agree about budgets and priorities, he presumed that members of the public household wouldn't either, but that they would work through those differences collectively, hopefully without coming to blows. So, part of my argument today is that the Wisconsin idea had this vision of government at its heart. It was premised on this concept of the public household as a way people work together for their collective good. And so at its heart, I would say that the Wisconsin idea has a prescription for a division of labor among the state or government, civil society, and the market or business. So now I'm going to move on to part two of my argument. What was going on here in Wisconsin in 2011, and what did it have to do with the Wisconsin idea? So I don't know, I presume that many of you who are here in the room remember 2011. Remember that from February 14th that year through most of the spring, up until about May 1st, there were large crowds protesting at the state capitol, crowds that on some days reached 100,000 people or more. And those crowds were made up of public sector workers, public sector union members, members of other unions who came out in solidarity with them, and a vast number of folks who didn't work in the public sector and were not union members. You may also remember that the UW Teaching Assistants Association organized an occupation of the Capitol building that went on for nearly a month, filling the rotunda with chants and music and sleeping bags and signs. And you probably remember that what triggered the protests was Governor Walker's announcement of Act 10, what he called the Budget Repair Bill, that virtually eliminated collective bargaining rights for public sector workers and made it hard for public unions to be certified. So the protests were definitely about that, but I want to argue today, as I suggested, that something else was going on as well. And based on my observations at the time, I suppose that some anthropologists and sociologists would call them participant observations, and my conversations with people who were there and with to participate or to observe, both then and later, I believe that the protests marked a turning point or a flashpoint in an underlying debate about the role of the public sector in the economy. On the one side were those who sided with the Wisconsin idea and Daniel Bell and saw the state sector as providing essential goods and services. And on the other were those like Walker and the Republican legislators who felt the public sector's growth was detrimental to human liberty and drained resources from the economy. So why do I feel this way? This underlying debate about the value of the public sector first became apparent to me when I heard then U.S. Senator Tom Coburn on the TV news saying that, this is a quote, "These government employees," referring to the protesters, "produce no net economic benefit to our country. Matter of fact, they produce negative economic benefit." Rush Limbaugh, not surprisingly, on his radio show, echoed this view. He said, "Public employees do not produce anything. They're not making widgets." Some media reports that appeared in response to the protests referred to public workers as the new welfare queens. They denigrated public workers as tax eaters who lived off hardworking taxpayers. A teacher standing outside the Capitol in February 2011 responded to these views, and this was a speech that I heard that really moved me. He said, he'd heard the TV news, he said, "They say I produce nothing, but I produce engineers and doctors, accountants and scientists, nurses and architects." And that phrasing really stuck with me. Then as I walked around, I saw signs that the protesters carried, and many of them echoed that same theme. Some as simple as the pervasive "I heart my teacher," but others homemade that said, "Remember this when you hit a pothole. Don't scapegoat public workers." And in the very wordy, earnest, Wisconsin kind of way, "I dislike taxes, but I like schools, firefighters, roads, parks, and most police officers." That was a sign. For many protesters who showed up at the Capitol, the state workers who were losing their bargaining rights became a symbol of public services. And as the uprising went on into March, people who came in the beginning to protest the loss of collective bargaining rights began to make common cause with those who showed up later to protest Walker's austerity budget, which was released that month, with its deep cuts to services. These individuals rejected the idea that public goods were a drain on the economy. They saw them as investments in the economy. So let's step back for a moment and think about how we got here. Over the course of the 20th century, public workers came to provide many services crucial to families and households. With the advent of public schools, mothers and fathers didn't have to teach their own children. Cities and counties took over snow plowing roads and collecting garbage. They got involved later in transporting the elderly to doctor's appointments and providing after-school care. And over the past 2 decades, as wages have stagnated and families and individuals have to work more hours, public services have become even more important. So, as Robert Pollin and Jeff Thompson have written to economists, For generations now, state and local governments have been the most important providers of education, of healthcare, of public safety, and other vital forms of support for families. And they argued that the 2001 battle in Wisconsin was the most dramatic expression of a struggle that is ongoing throughout the country over the fate of future of state and local governments. So in the face of arguments by the governor and the legislature that society could no longer afford these kinds of services, the protesters were reasserting their centrality to people's lives. As I was doing the research for my book, I talked with a wide range of people about what they thought was at stake in the protests. So one union activist told me, "I think it was clearly that people understood this really to be an attack not just on unions. That wasn't even the main thing. It was really an attack on public services, on the community. People responded because they saw this as an attack on their children's teachers, the people they count on every day." A teacher told us, "The public sector runs so deep in every community that what happened was people would take this," meaning the issues of the protest, "back home at night to the dinner table. They take it to church on Sunday. They take it to the PTA meetings, and so on." A public worker added, "A lot of people came out in support of schools, in support of snowplow drivers, in support of the folks who work in municipal offices, and basically said, no, we respect the services that are provided in our state." But in my research, I didn't just talk to people who showed up at the protests. I also talked to leaders in Wisconsin's business community about their view of the protests and also about the government's role in the economy. I knew that Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce and similar organizations had supported Walker, and so I expected to hear some version, when I talked to them, some version of Walker's claim that Wisconsin is broke, or another quote from him, "What is failing us is the expanse of government," or, quoting Ronald Reagan, "As government expands, liberty contracts," or, quoting Walker again, "We can no longer live in a society where public employees are the haves and the taxpayers who foot the bill are the have-nots." That's what I expected. But instead, the question often elicited a list of what business needed from government. Not just roads and bridges, but also a stable regulatory environment, support for a high-quality workforce, essential services, a social safety net, and supportive programs for business. One former head of Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce said, "Infrastructure is important. You've got to have ports, good roads, a good highway system. The tech world needs to get around a lot, and they need good airports. If you don't have it, you're not going to see a lot of growth." Another mentioned the need for government to provide counter-cyclical stimulus during recession and spoke approvingly of some aspects of Obama's 2008 stimulus plan, and even of China's subsidies for business. What I heard in these interviews sounded far more like Wisconsin's German heritage progressive business leaders in the early 20th century than did the rhetoric of Wisconsin's national stage politicians. And that's why I thought it was extremely interesting that 2 weeks ago, the fourth one of Walker's cabinet a fourth member of Walker's cabinet resigned. The head of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation that Walker had established to replace the old Department of Commerce, and he resigned to campaign for Tony Evers. This was Paul Jaden, and he was one of the people that we interviewed for this project. So I think that was telling about where the sympathies of the business community in the state, at least part of them, lie. So the Wisconsin idea and the 2011 protests, in my view, both had a vision of the public household at their center. But connecting the two movements raises a really thorny question. How did Wisconsin go from being a leader of the nation in building the public household in the early 20th century to a model for how to dismantle it in the early 21st? Because after all, Walker won on Act 10. He won the recall. He promoted his budget repair bill and his response to the protests as a model for the nation. And at least 12 other states passed laws that were modeled on Act 10. So I want to focus on this third question for the final part of my talk. This question, how we went from building to dismantling public sector institutions, led me to the reading rooms of the State Historical Society Library. In the summer of 2014, as I was sitting in that beautiful space, flipping through the pages of a 1939 issue of a magazine called The Wisconsin Taxpayer, I came across the following passage. Taxpayers, except those who directly benefit from state employees' salaries, are beginning to question the whys and wherefores of the recent increases in public salaries and payrolls. As taxes continue to increase, these questions will continue to increase, will rise to the point of resentment. Public employees, their organizations, and the departments that employ them will rise in defense if present rumblings indicate coming events. An open clash may result. So I was startled. Was I mistaken about the date of the issue? Had I pulled the wrong box off the shelves? This sounded like a description of what was happening in 2011, not 1939. And so this decades-old quote inspired me to search for information about previous episodes of conflict over the public sector in Wisconsin. So we know that the debate over the size and function of government is a central theme of our democracy, and it's always present in our public discourse. It's one aspect of an underlying tension between principles of individualism and those of communitarianism, between Horatio Alger's stories of self-made individuals and Norman Rockwell paintings of collective barn raisings. But over the course of the past 100 years in Wisconsin, collective tempers have flared around the issue 3 times, as I said before, in the 1930s, the 1970s, and 2011. And the resolution of those tensions was different in each case. And I believe those different outcomes have implications for where we find ourselves today. So, the first great battle over the role of the state came during the Great Depression. The Depression left, in Franklin Roosevelt's words, a third of the nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished. It challenged the idea that markets left to their own devices would correct themselves. The crisis left leaders at all levels of government casting about for solutions, for new models of economic policy. And some of them turned to the writings in England of the economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynes advocated the use of fiscal and monetary tools to mitigate the effects of recessions and depressions, and he encouraged the expansion of the social safety net to bolster aggregate demand, consumer spending. These views found their way into many New Deal policies, including the provision of relief and work programs for the unemployed. Well, the business community in Wisconsin was split over the issue of relief. The stalwart wing of the Republican Party argued that the additional taxes that relief required impinged on the individual freedom of hardworking people, and it took money from those who used it wisely and put it in the pockets of those who would not use it well, and it drove business from the state. These arguments may sound familiar. This group, the stalwarts, formed the Wisconsin Taxpayers Association in 1932 to advocate for small government and against tax increases. On the other hand, the progressive wing of the Republican Party, the part that Bob La Follette was part of, joined with Democrats, socialists, labor unions, and urban mayors to support relief programs. The state became very highly polarized around this issue. The socialist mayor of Milwaukee, Daniel Hone, articulated the pro-relief view this way in a radio address. Much as we dislike to pay our tax bills, the fact is that government has stood like the Rock of Gibraltar during this frightful depression to save us the agonies of complete chaos. While the banks bailed, factories closed, shops went bankrupt, pyramided utilities collapsed, the government was expected to function with more vigor and energy than ever. Meanwhile, stalwarts produced editorials and cartoons complaining that government had been hijacked by vested interest, pressure groups, and lobbies. Issues of the Wisconsin Taxpayer from this period featured cartoons of bloated government bureaucrats being pulled in carts by skinny taxpayers, of taxpayers as pack horses, as dead horses, and as maple trees being tapped by government programs, of government as Santa Claus. The publication criticized criticized proposals for new inheritance and estate taxes in terms that are remarkably contemporary, referring to them as death taxes, something that we've heard recently. As the New Deal continued, small government conservatives in the state expressed skepticism about Roosevelt's Social Security program, running a cartoon of Mother Hubbard going to the Social Security cabinet and finding it bare. As in 2011, public employees became lightning rods in the debate. The quote that we just looked at showed that. In response, the defenders of the public sector called out the popular tendency to assign to public employees the role of villain in the tragedy of present economic conditions, complaining that it was becoming generally accepted as a fact that public employees are extravagant bureaucrats, time-serving payrollers, and non-productive parasites, sort of like the welfare queens of 2011. But the defenders of the public sector worried that municipal reformers who had labored for a generation to professionalize government and improve its image would see new waves of hostility and cuts damage the reform edifice. So people had been working from the early part of the century to remedy the kind of corruption that we talked about at the beginning, and they were afraid that that work would all be undone. The president of the University of Wisconsin weighed in, warning that the spread of anti-government ideology would divert individuals from public service. So how were these tensions resolved in the 1930s? In short, Wisconsin's stalwarts could not gain traction for their small government view during the Great Depression. Too many citizens held classical free market liberalism responsible for the economy's crisis and the Depression. Too many people perceived the fiscal conservatism of the stalwarts to be a stale and discredited solution to dire new problems. But that's not the only thing. Of equal or perhaps more importance, after the election of Franklin Roosevelt, the Wisconsin progressives, who for decades had been engaged in creative acts of state building in their own backyards, received substantial new support from national level politicians. They had allies in Washington. The New Deal political apparatus in DC generated and popularized new ways of thinking about the state's role in the economy and provided resources to build institutions and programs around them. And this connection to a successful national level political project bolstered the ability of local progressives to continue building the state's public household. So we're going to time travel very quickly here between the 30s and the 70s. Between the 1930s and the 70s, lawmakers and politicians at both the state and federal levels worked to build and consolidate public institutions. Roosevelt expanded income tax collection and parlayed new taxes that were imposed during the Second World War into permanent support for government programs. With these new resources and popular support, the government put in place labor regulations to govern hours of work and wages and to establish the right to join a union. It introduced business regulations that restructured the banking industry and broke up public utility holding companies. It devised a Social Security program that provided resources for old age and for widows and orphans of workers. It provided resources for rural electrification, fostered farm ownership, and gave work to the unemployed. We know that these new programs excluded many citizens. Most African American farmers did not benefit from the farm bills, and domestic and agricultural workers, largely African American and also disproportionately female, were excluded from the National Labor Relations Act. Nevertheless, Roosevelt and his allies forged a new vision of what government could do to improve the everyday lives of its citizens, and unprecedented government institutions designed to make that vision a reality. So as U.S. global hegemony and the Cold War during the 50s bolstered growth, and a growing tax base kept up with demands for state services, the debates over the size of government were kind of muted. Daniel Bell says that growth acts as a political solvent, because when the pie's growing, you don't have to have debates about how it's going to be divided up. It provides the means to finance social welfare expenditures and defense without reallocating income. This was true in Wisconsin as well as in the nation as a whole. It was a fairly quiet time. The state's economy blossomed from manufacturing on the shores of Lake Michigan to the paper mills of the Fox Valley to the dairies and the vegetable farms in between. But during this long economic expansion, what some people call the golden age of U.S. capitalism, small government conservatives didn't just change their minds. They continued to hone their views on the issue of the public sector in think tanks, in places like the University of Chicago Economics Department, and they worked to systematize a new version of economic liberalism, what we call today, at least on college campuses, neoliberalism, that would present an alternative to Keynesianism and social democratic principles. Rather than simply opposing big government, they worked to articulate a positive vision and a reform agenda. And these efforts created what sociologist Berta Taylor has called a movement in abeyance, a social movement that manages to sustain and reinvent itself through unreceptive periods in order to mount a challenge in another period. In other words, play a long game. While the ideas that were brewing in the think tanks and Chicago had little impact on political programs at the high point of the U.S. Golden Age, these scholars and businessmen and policy entrepreneurs were developing a radical set of free market policy prescriptions that would be on hand for future decades. Beginning in the 1960s, the tone of the debate about the public sector, both nationally and in Wisconsin, began to shift. Even as the war on poverty expanded the social safety net and social movements advocated still further investments. You could see the shift in Ronald Reagan's 1964 Republican National Convention speech, in which he proclaimed that the U.S. welfare state had broken with the nation's founding principles and represented a threat to freedom as significant as Soviet communism. As small government conservatism gained strength in the 60s and 70s, taxation once again became the site for debating the size and role of the state. According to the president of the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, who we also interviewed for the project, the baby boom generation was building homes, building subdivisions, needing streets, needing sewers, needing schools, and by the late 60s, needing universities. This put pressure on local property taxes, which by the 1970s in Wisconsin, the early 70s, had reached historic highs. Businesses demanded tax breaks, and activism around the property tax resurged. In Racine, Wisconsin, an organization called SOS, Stop Outlandish Spending, lobbied against a school bond issue and led to the closure of at least one school. These trends set the stage for a major confrontation over the public sector in 1974. In the wake of the 1973 oil crisis, some of you might remember, we had inflation rates that reached 12%. And workers in many states struck for raises to compensate for the declining value of their salaries, which couldn't buy as much anymore. This included a number of teacher strikes in Madison, but the decade's most contentious strike took place in the Outagamie County town of Hortonville, Wisconsin, a village of 2,000 that was home to several paper mills. After months of stalled labor negotiations, Hortonville's 88 teachers went out on strike in March 1974, asking for a double-digit raise to compensate for the inflation rate. Administrators offered them 1.2%. In response, the teachers walked out, and the school district fired them. But it's the community response that made this incident noteworthy. A group of local men, calling themselves the Vigilantes, swore vengeance against the teachers, hanging them in effigy and making death threats. One man walked into the teachers' union hall brandishing a six-shooter, and this began to make national news, as you can imagine. I'm not sure if I have another photograph or not. No, I don't. In the heated debate that was surrounding the strike, public employees once again became the lightning rod in a battle about the public sector and its cost. Now, many Hortonville residents were union members. They were in the paper mill workers, and they had a union in the paper mill. But they saw the strikes by public employees as fundamentally different. One of them told a local paper, "Teachers must remember that their employers are the people of these communities, who are obliged to finance education by heavy taxes imposed on them." A broader debate about the public sector's role lay just beneath the surface. The Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce took the Hortonville strike as evidence of the increasing scope and arrogance of the public employee monopoly. At the time of the skirmish in Hortonville, the small state worldview developed in think tanks and the University of Chicago was beginning to regain traction in broader political culture, but it had not yet become the dominant strand in Wisconsin's political culture. If the 1970s saw small government conservatism begin to flex its muscles, the 1980s saw it develop its strength. The movement found a charismatic spokesperson in Ronald Reagan, who's frequently credited with ushering in a new era of neoliberal political practice in the US. In 1981, Reagan showed what this new era would mean for labor when he used the Taft-Hartley Act to fire striking air traffic controllers and break their union. Reagan promoted tax cuts as a move to take money out of the hands of government and give it to average Americans. He then used the threat of deficits to justify cutting safety net programs and government investments. The era's enthusiasm for small government was reflected in Grover Norquist's well-publicized 1985 founding of Americans for Tax Reform, with its mantra about shrinking government until it could be drowned in a bathtub. There was something missing here, which is basically when I said that these ideas that were growing dominant in the nation did not yet find a home in Wisconsin's political culture, it was because the way that those strikes in 1974 were resolved was that we got our binding mediation arbitration law for public workers. So, which was, basically said whenever there's a dispute that the employers have to sit down at the table, the state has to sit down at the table with them. So the political culture of the state, that strike in Hortonville notwithstanding, had still not yet given up on the idea of the public household in the 1970s. During the 1980s, the ideas that Ronald Reagan was expressing in Washington found a home in Wisconsin. Republican Governor Tommy Thompson introduced an array of new initiatives here that reconfigured government programs to meet tests of supply and demand and efficiency and cost rather than broader political and social aims. He was basically implementing some of the plans that had been developed in these conservative think tanks. He initiated state-level welfare reforms that became the model for Clinton's 1996 nationwide reform. and that led to the dismantling of the state's cash welfare program. Milwaukee's Bradley Foundation and the Heritage Foundation provided him with templates for the nation's first school voucher program. These experiments continued through the 1990s, but the strong growth of that decade was the kind of political solvent that Daniel Bell talked about. It muted some of their effects. The welfare policies that Thompson was experimenting with hurt people less when there were jobs to be found and the economy was growing and wages were rising. The resources that the vouchers siphoned from public schools were less damaging than they would be when the economy ceased expanding. But that changed. That changed when the economy sank into recession in the following decade. The 2003 recession hit Wisconsin hard, particularly the southeastern cities. The far worse 2008 downturn was deeper in Wisconsin than nationally and left the state trailing the U.S. average in GDP growth, job growth, and wage growth. So this brings us to 2011 and Act 10 and the protests. By that time, 100,000 people in the Capitol Square was not enough to stem the tide of small government conservatism. How do we explain this outcome? There are several possible reasons. One possibility is that it has something to do with temporality. There's a political scientist, Mark Blythe, who said, in understanding the role of ideas and institutional change, sequence is everything. So, as I mentioned before, during the Great Depression, New Dealers succeeded in pinning blame for the economic crisis on unregulated markets and on the business community. And a substantial portion of the citizenry saw the protests of stalwarts and anti-tax activists as backward-looking and mired in solutions of the past. They wanted something else, and the public household was a new solution. And this created the opening to experiment with and build social welfare institutions. But when the U.S. economy faltered in 2008, small government conservatives were able to promote downsizing the public sector as a new approach to economic crisis and to government. The second thing that seems to matter to the outcomes of these episodes is the connection of local actors to national level political movements. And as we saw in the early 20th century, Wisconsin was this breeding ground for progressive ideas and institutions. Its politicians and intellectuals gained national reputations and developed strong relationships with individuals and institutions in Washington. Power flowed in both directions. Wisconsinites influenced national politicians' vision of what was possible and desirable for the state to do, and those national level connections bolstered the ability of the state's politicians to construct strong programs. In the 70s, here's the part I left out, when local groups mounted tax protests and challenged striking public workers, they didn't get that kind of material support from national level political figures or institutions that allowed them to gain traction to significantly reconfigure government. They were like voices in the wilderness at that time. The end result of the teacher strike was not a statewide outcry like that in Hortonville, but the mediation arbitration law that made the arbitration of bargaining impasses compulsory. By 2011, local actors who wanted to shrink the state found backing not just in the National Republican Party and the Tea Party, but a host of other well-financed national entities. These included the American Legislative Exchange Council, which offered templates for new legislative initiatives, a densely interconnected web of think tanks, including the Bradley Foundation, Heritage Foundation, Manhattan Institute, MacIver Institute, Cato Institute. A growing network of extremely wealthy donors freed by the Supreme Court's Citizen United decision to endow a shifting set of issue organizations that funded both political campaigns and government initiatives. And once again, Wisconsin political figures This time, those on the side of small government were well networked on the national political scene. Reince Priebus chaired the Republican National Committee. Paul Ryan played a leadership role in the party. Michael Grebe ran the nationally influential Bradley Foundation and Walker's campaign. Eric O'Keefe was a founder of the Tea Party movement. As Scott Walker and legislators crafted plans to roll back public sector workers' rights and slash the state budget, they counted on abundant national support, backing that proved crucial, for example, in allowing Walker to survive the recall campaign mounted in response to his actions. So, by 2011, conditions in the state of Wisconsin resembled in many ways those that Gwen Drury described for the early part of the 20th century. Mirroring trends across the nation, income inequality in Wisconsin was at its highest level since the Great Depression. Citizens United had opened the door for the great wealth at the top to be translated into political power. Voter ID laws and gerrymandering weakened the voices of the electorate. Meanwhile, the families of great wealth of our generation, the Koch brothers, the Mercers, the Waltons, financed projects to hobble unions, cut social services, privatize schools and prisons, defund public universities, and undermine Social Security and Medicare. So this leaves us with a burning question. The Wisconsin idea played such an important role in building the public household, both in our state and across the nation. In the present context, what role can it play in shaping our response to attempts to dismantle it? So I leave you with that. It's a little hard for me to see you because of the lights in my eyes, but I see a hand.
So I've been really, reading a lot about this idea of the long game, and I was really fascinated that Wisconsin Taxpayers Magazine. Where did that come from? Was that Is there something we could find out more about that? Because that seems like I bet there was some financing for that.
Well, it was a group
that was in Wisconsin somewhere that was being published.
Yeah, there were a group of business people who came together, mostly from the stalwart wing of the Republican Party. I think they met in Appleton to found this thing, and they put their own money behind it. And it was incredibly slanted and opinionated, and the kind of cartoons that you saw for the first, 10 or 12 years. And then they decided that they needed to become more nonpartisan. And so you can read it today, and they have textbooks that are actually used in some schools about how government works and how government's funded. And it's much less opinionated. It's a good source of information, or actually a very reliable source of information about state expenditures. And so it's evolved from where it started. But it's still privately funded by the business community, I think.
So is the Taxpayers Association different than the Taxpayers Alliance?
The taxpayers, in Wisconsin, we have the Taxpayers Alliance, I think.
Right. I thought at an earlier point.
I might have called it. I think there's only one organization.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's, yeah. But thanks for pointing that out. I need to check the wording. Chat.
So I'm really very interested in this research finding that when you did these interviews with business people in Wisconsin around the time of the Act 10 protest, that the results were not what you expected and not what I would expect either. And I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about what you learned about the business interest in Wisconsin. I guess I'm interested in whether there were particular sectors of the economy, particular types of firms that were more likely to voiced the attitudes that you described? So was it that kind of division? Was it a division between sort of labor intensive versus capital intensive, or small versus large firms? And so that's one question. The other question was, so those business people that you spoke to who did understand the need for a public household of some sort, did those people support Walker nevertheless? And if so, why? What was the reason for that?
Well, I didn't do a kind of random sample of different businesses in the state, so I'm not really sure I can comment on the variability. But one thing that was universal, and I think it always is in business, is that you want stability. You want a stable business climate. Unless you're doing some kind of arbitrage finance stuff, you want stability. And all of the business people that we interviewed were disturbed by the upheaval around Act 10. One person said, "This is the worst divisiveness I've ever seen, and I lived through Vietnam." So people just wanted things to calm down, and they wanted to know from one year to the next what policies were going to be in place. They wanted that stable regulatory environment. Every single person said that. And people did express, the head of Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce was married to a teacher. So I have no idea what their conversations around the dinner table were like at home. But so they demonstrated a kind of understanding of both sides of the issue, but on balance, they thought that Walker was going to be good for the state. They thought he was going to cut the red tape. They were, hopeful about that. And I think we always know that when small government conservatives talk about cutting government expenditures, they don't exactly mean cutting all government expenditures. There's always a desire for business to get certain things that it needs. And so I'm not sure that they were that unusual in saying, we think we need subsidies. We think that we need not just infrastructure, but workforce development. But that was very much at odds with the kind of national level rhetoric that was coming out of Walker and Reince Priebus and Paul Ryan. They didn't quote Ayn Rand to me the way that Paul Ryan was doing on the national stage at that moment. It was much more practical. Yeah.
Following up on that, is it that the business community just sort of generally was a quasi-friendly place for these ideologues like Paul Ryan and others to kind of make more of this, to amplify whatever felt needs there were in the business community, kind of appropriate or hijack it? I mean, do you think in some way that happened?
Well, I mean, first of all, they had a lot of support from outside the state, and they had enough support from the business community in the state to make their project work. But I do think that in the past, few months, when we've seen so many people jumping off jumping off the ship. I won't make any predictions about whether it's a sinking ship or not. But we've seen so many people leaving the administration. It's because there's a sense that their regrets have gotten bigger than their hopes, I guess. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah.
Yes?
You may not know the answer to this, but when people like Rush Limbaugh say that they want a small government, do they have a place in mind that already exists, like a country, or they draw these ideas from and they hope like the state will become?
That's a really good question. I mean, I have never heard them say this is the ideal. Well, okay, there is an exception to that. Jamie Peck has written a book called Construction of Neoliberal Reason, where he argues that after the 1973 coup in Chile, that the kinds of austerity measures that were put in place there and the kinds of anti-democratic constitution that was implemented is one model that US politicians often look to. So for example, now when people are talking about having a constitutional convention to redo our constitution, it's to redo it in the model of Chile. And Chile was remade, and this is all totally transnational. Those innovations in Chile were made with a lot of participation of University of Chicago economists from the United States. So we used Chile as a kind of experiment station to create a very pared down state. And now that's to some extent a model for the US. But also they tend to look back in time for their models, like sometime before the New Deal. It's not clear exactly what time period, but you get this kind of nostalgia for an earlier era when people were more independent and less dependent on government. It's an interesting question, though.
I got one more. To what extent were these three events or these periods, these moments, related to sort of swings in populism? Were these particularly populist moments that I know the last one probably, there was this pretty big upsurge in populism, both the left and right, but do you think that had anything to do with it? That being anti-elitist in some way transgresses into anti-government, anti-public?
I wish I were sure in my own mind about what, Chad, why don't you say something to that? I feel very ill-equipped to talk about populism because I'm not convinced I know what it means across different time periods and across different political affiliations. So do you have an answer to that?
I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's a very interesting question, and it touches on some of the things that you spoke about, the desire to professionalize government, and I do wonder if there's some kind of connection there, but I don't know. I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, there's populist rhetoric and then there's a populist movement, and I think that populist rhetoric was clearly at issue in several of these instances, but as a movement, I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, maybe a different way to put this is, to what extent do you think that the kind of counter reaction against the public household model is also a kind of reaction against expertise, or the role of expertise in policymaking, or something of that sort?
Anybody else want to answer? When they're really hard questions, I like to farm them out to the audience.
I don't know the answer either.
Yeah. I mean, we hear that a lot, but I don't know to what extent it's a real issue for people. Like, I don't want people who know anything making decisions about my life. It doesn't sound like a really good political platform to me, but it's rhetorically powerful. But I don't know to what extent that makes people join social movements and burn teachers in effigy.
I mean, there's of course this pattern that has been well documented about the declining trust in government since the 1960s, and if that is in some way maybe connected to declining trust in experts or in expertise or in other social institutions, again, you can see that there might be some kind of linkage there.
Yeah, and you can definitely hear it in some of the quotes, that sense that.
Well, we have sort of anti-intellectual moments, and when universities come under fire, and when policy wonks come around. A lot of the discourse on at the street level, and even in the news, is about, which is no difference now, is, well, what are these smarty pants in ivory tower? Now, I'm out there working with my hands, and I know, what do they know? And actually, I had this happen last week. I'm appointed a cranberry marketing thing by the USDA. And we're having a conversation in a conference call where I said, well, if we're having to destroy crop because we don't sell enough. And I was pointing out that generally speaking in marketing, if you're having to throw away a large percentage of your product, you're just not marketing hard enough. You know? And this guy, who's a grower, just said, I tell you what, Mr. University guy, why don't you go buy a bog and then tell me about cranberries? Now, that was just this out of the blue, sort of intellectual, like, I'm a public appointee. I'm supposed to represent the public's interest in the cranberry industry. And so, you know, just when you have these very vitriolic kind of comments to academics about, well, what would you know? You don't actually do these things. You just talk about them. An attack on expertise is part of populist movements, typically. And I think people see government as career experts and question their competence in doing that.
Yeah. But I think there are also powerful interests that are able to parlay that critique of expertise into an attack on government in a way that is really, they found very powerful.
It's a warm nest for ideologues.
Yeah. We have another comment or question over here.
Truly, this is not, I know there's not an answer to this question, but what you've brought up for me is more of a question about politics of Wisconsin. We've mentioned that the Taxpayers Alliance came out of what was happening and opinions in Appleton, Wisconsin. Appleton, Wisconsin seems to be quite a location for a lot of different things and movements here. One being the John Birch Society. So there's a whole host of things at play here in Wisconsin.
And those are connected. Some of those same actors were involved in both of those. Yeah.
So when I think about the long-range plan of a political movement in response to things like the Wisconsin idea, and I think about Milwaukee and the Bradley Foundation and the Fox River Valley, I'm holding that curiosity of between the 1930s and the 1970s, there was a lot going on. It wasn't near, and yet quietly, and yet major movements happening, and that have flared up. And so I'm truly wondering about how that hasn't been discussed in our, I don't know, I'm just...
No, it is. That was what was so interesting to me, was the idea that during this whole period when we thought that the issue had been resolved, it hadn't been resolved. That all of those currents of our political life were still going on, but some of them were just beneath the surface or in abeyance, as the sociologist said for a while. Yes, there are two questions there. So first, the closest person to me, and then the far back.
Comparing the reaction from the 1930s, the Great Depression, that was, they said, well, that was the free market business that created this problem. We're going to do something different. But then in 2008, couldn't you say the same thing? That was the free market, that was these banks creating these problems, but yet we reacted totally different. Were we told different things? We were marketed differently? Or?
It was really interesting because even the Wall Street Journal and The Economist in 2008 said, okay, Keynes is coming back, because we've had, it's obviously free markets and deregulation that's responsible for this crash. But for the bulk of the public, they hadn't, somehow they interpreted it as, okay, we've had big government for a really long time, and look where it got us. Now we need something new. Because Ronald Reagan he was railing against big government. He wasn't as far as they were concerned, he didn't institute something altogether new, even though in a sense he did. Well, if you look at his budget deficit was huge because he was spending and cutting taxes. So yeah, the general public interpreted that as the austerity and the cuts as something new in relation to the big government they felt we had had in the past. And it's mind-boggling. I mean, the economists in the Wall Street Journal had to eat their words because they thought that it would go the other way, as you said. Yeah.
Yeah, I prefer to, instead of saying the Trump bounce, it's the Obama bounce that we're still living off of, and that Trump's tariffs and his some of his economic fiddlings are messing up the Obama, the last big, or one of the big successes of Obama, the Obama era. But my question is about how the Wisconsin idea and government impinging on existing social network structures, like particularly in religion, where I think Charles Silverstein wrote a book on the Depression, and one of the characteristics that he noted was that part of the Depression that the churches themselves failed to make to close the gap with the terrible effects of the Depression, that the government had to step in because there was really no other choice to bring the entities and the money to actually overcome that gap. But in some ways it explains at least the radical Christians participating so heavily against government is.
Yeah, that's a really interesting part of that division of labor that we're talking about between the state and the market and civil society. I guess you would place churches in that third civil society sector. And yeah, I'd really left their role out of the story, but I think it could be put back in really interesting ways. But I don't know too much about that, so you might have to do that. So are we done? Okay.
We're pretty close, yeah. That was wonderful. I just have one update. Says President Trump blaming Paul Ryan for a very bad night.